The rain that fell on Greyfell Manor was a special kind of miserable. It was not the cleansing, dramatic downpour of a summer storm, nor the soft, renewing drizzle of spring. It was a persistent, sullen weeping from a sky the color of dishwater, a liquid manifestation of the oppressive gloom that had seeped into the very stones of the house. For Lady Elara Vance, the rain was simply the world outside mirroring the state of her soul. She stood in the narrow corridor of the servants' wing, a place she was meant to inhabit but never truly belonged to, her fingers tracing the condensation on a grimy pane of glass. At 20, she should have been entering her third season, a whirlwind of silks, dance cards, and flirtatious glances. Instead, her world had shrunk to these dim hallways, the dusty corners of the library she was permitted to clean, and the solitary walks she stole in the gardens when she was certain no one was watching. Her reflection was a watery ghost in the glass. The face that stared back was too pale. The eyes, a deep violet that had once been her mother's pride, were shadowed with a weariness that did not belong to youth. Her inheritance of fine bones and a graceful neck was lost beneath a drab, ill-fitting gown of gray wool, a deliberate choice by her stepfather's wife to render her invisible. Since her mother's death 6 years prior, Elara had become a phantom in her own home, a financial burden her stepfather, Baron Croft, bore with theatrical resentment. He had married her mother for her fortune, a fortune he had systematically squandered on bad investments and worse habits. All that remained was the crumbling estate and Elara herself, an unmarried stepdaughter with no dowry and, therefore, no prospects. The Baron had made it his personal mission to erase her. He forbade her from receiving visitors, declined invitations on her behalf without her knowledge, and presented to the world a fiction in which he was a beleaguered widower with no dependents. Society, with its short memory and appetite for convenience, had obliged him. Lady Elara Vance had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. A sharp voice cut through the quiet drumming of the rain. "Elara, stop dawdling by the window like a moonstruck calf. The Baron has a guest arriving. See to it that you are neither seen nor heard." It was Mrs. Croft, the Baron's second wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched her existence. It was not a difficult command to obey. There were 1,000 shadowy corners in Greyfell for a ghost to occupy. She retreated to the kitchens, where the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and the comfortable clatter of pots and pans. Cook, a stout woman with flour-dusted eyebrows and a perpetually kind expression, offered her a sympathetic glance. "Important guest, is it?" Elara nodded, accepting a warm slice of bread. The simple kindness made her throat tighten. "I am to vanish." Vanish," Cook snorted, kneading a mound of dough with impressive force. "As if this house would stand upright without you seeing to the linens and the books. Let the Baron and his lady play their games. You're worth 10 of them." The sentiment, though appreciated, felt hollow. What was her worth, if no one outside these kitchen walls knew she drew breath? She ate the bread slowly, the warmth spreading through her cold hands. From this vantage point, she could hear the muffled sounds from the front of the house, the crunch of carriage wheels on the wet gravel, the heavy thud of the main door, the low murmur of masculine voices. Curiosity, a dangerous and often painful emotion, pricked at her. Who could possibly be visiting the Baron, a man whose credit was so poor that even the local butcher demanded cash up front? Driven by an impulse she couldn't suppress, she crept from the kitchens and back into the servants' corridor that ran parallel to the main hall. There was a small Judas gate in the paneling, a peephole once used by butlers to observe the progress of a dinner party, now covered in a thick layer of dust. Wiping it clean with her sleeve, Elara pressed her eye to the opening. Her view was of the grand, decaying entrance hall. The Baron, his waistcoat a little too tight, his face flushed with a mixture of obsequiousness and brandy, was bowing low. Before him stood a man who seemed to absorb all the light from the room, dim as it was. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate black broadcloth that bespoke a fortune the Baron could only dream of. His hair was the color of jet, and his face, which she could see in profile, was a study in aristocratic severity. Wealthy, powerful and, since the tragic death of his wife 2 years ago, the most eligible and emotionally remote man in England. Stories swirled around him like the mists that were said to haunt his ancestral home, that he was cruel, that his heart was made of ice, that he had never shed a tear for his dead wife. What could such a man want with Baron Croft? The Duke finally moved his head, his gaze sweeping the hall with an air of profound disinterest. His eyes were a startling grey, the color of a winter sea. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Croft," he said. His voice was a low baritone, cold and clear as a struck bell. It carried an implicit command that brooked no argument. "You know why I am here. Your letter was descriptive." Of course, Your Grace," the Baron stammered, gesturing toward the drawing room. "If you would step this way. Some refreshment? A fine Madeira?" "I require no refreshment," the Duke cut in, his tone slicing through the Baron's sycophantic babble. "I require a conclusion to this business. Bring her in." Ilara's blood ran cold. Her? A woman? The Baron was selling something, that much was clear. But what? Or who? Her mind raced. Had he hired a new governess he was passing off as a lady of quality? Was he trying to arrange a match for Mrs. Croft's pinched, unmarriageable cousin? She heard the Baron clear his throat, a nervous, rattling sound. "She is preparing herself, Your Grace. A young lady wishes to look her best, you understand." The Duke made a sound of impatience. "I am not here to admire a costume. I am here to inspect the foundation. My agents have confirmed the particulars of your situation. The bloodline is acceptable. The lack of social connection is, for my purposes, ideal. Her isolation is a chief asset. Now, produce her." Isolation is a chief asset. The word struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Her prison, her shame, the source of her deepest loneliness. To this man, it was a desirable quality. A cold dread, far worse than anything she had ever felt, began to coil in her stomach. She knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, who they were talking about. She stumbled triumphant excitement. "There you are," she said, her voice unusually breathless. "Come with me, and for heaven's sake try to look presentable. Your entire future, our entire future, depends on it." She grabbed Ilara's arm, her fingers digging into the thin wool of her sleeve. Ilara felt herself being pulled forward, a puppet whose strings were held by grasping, desperate hands. She was being led from the shadows into the harsh, unforgiving light, to be inspected by a man who valued her for her obscurity. Her heart, which had fluttered with a desperate hope for freedom just moments before, now beat a slow, funereal rhythm. She was not being rescued from her cage. She was being sold into a larger, colder, more gilded one. The drawing room at Greyfell was a testament to faded glory. The silk on the settees was frayed, the gilt on the mirror frames was tarnished, and a persistent scent of damp clung to the heavy velvet curtains. Yet, as Ilara was propelled into the room by Mrs. Croft, it felt like the grandest stage, and she the most unprepared of actors. The Duke of Blackwood stood by the hearth, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. He did not turn immediately, forcing them to wait, a subtle assertion of power that was as effective as it was effortless. When he finally did turn, his cool gray eyes swept over her. It was not a glance, but an assessment. He took in her worn dress, her unbound hair hastily tucked into a semblance of order, her pale, frightened face. There was no flicker of kindness, no hint of courtesy. It was the look a man might give a horse, checking its teeth and its fetlocks. Ilara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, but she met his gaze. She would not cower. It was the last shred of dignity she possessed. The Baron, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with anxiety. "Your Grace, may I present my stepdaughter, Lady Ilara Vance?" The Duke's gaze remained fixed on her. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Lady Ilara?" The title sounded foreign and mocking on his lips. He took a step closer, and Ilara had to fight the instinct to retreat. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. He was taller, perhaps, passed through his glacial eyes before being suppressed. He had expected silence, or perhaps a timid whisper. He turned his attention back to the Baron. "I find the terms of your letter acceptable, Croft. I will assume all your outstanding debts. The titles to Greyfell will be cleared. In return, I will have your stepdaughter's hand in marriage." The Baron's face, a mask of greed and relief, was grotesque. "Your Grace is most generous, most wise. Elara will make a fine duchess. She is quiet, biddable." "I require neither a fine duchess nor a biddable one," the Duke interrupted, his gaze snapping back to Elara. "I require a mother for my son, a chatelaine for my house. My heir needs a maternal figure. My household requires a mistress. These are positions that must be filled. I am offering Lady Elara a title, security, and a position of immense standing. In return, she will perform these duties." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the musty air. Then he addressed Elara directly, and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. "Let me be unequivocally clear, Lady Elara. This will be a marriage in name and in law only. My life, my time, and my heart are my own. They are not, and will not be, part of this arrangement. You will be the Duchess of Blackwood. You will have your own wing, your own staff, a generous allowance. You will want for nothing material. But you will not expect affection from me. You will not expect companionship. You will not expect love. Your duty will be to my son and to my house. In all other matters, we shall be strangers who share a roof. Do you understand these terms? Pensions." The brutality of his honesty was breathtaking. He was not just offering a loveless marriage, he was engineering one, drafting its cold constitution before her very eyes. He was building a wall between them and cementing it with words. Every romantic notion she had ever secretly harbored, every girlish dream of a loving partner, died a swift, clean death in that moment. There would be no courtship, no tender glances, no shared future. There would be a contract. Beneath it, a strange, hard resolve was forming. He wanted a duchess in name only. He wanted a stranger. Very well, she could be a stranger. She had years of practice at being invisible. "I understand the terms perfectly, Your Grace," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He had laid out the worst of it, expecting her to flinch, to weep, to protest. Her simple, stark acceptance seemed to discomfort him more than any emotional outburst would have. "And you accept them?" he pressed. She thought of the rain-streaked window, of the endless, grey days stretching before her at Greyfell. She thought of being sold. Then she thought of the boy, his son, a purpose. "I accept," she said. The Duke gave a final, decisive nod. "Excellent. There is no reason to delay. We will be married by special license at the end of the week. My solicitor will be in touch with you, Croft, to settle the accounts. Have her ready." With that, he turned on his heel and strode from the room without a backward glance. He did not say goodbye. He did not offer her his hand. The transaction was complete. He had purchased a duchess. The Baron let out a whooping laugh, slapping his thigh. "Done! By God, it's done! Did you hear him, my dear? All my debts cleared. Elara, you clever girl, you've saved us." Elara did not look at him. She stared at the empty doorway through which the Duke had departed. The air still seemed to vibrate with his cold presence. She had not saved anyone. She had just been sold. And as the reality of her new life began to dawn, she felt a profound and desolate sense of finality. Her past was over. Her future had been signed away. She was now the property of the Duke of Blackwood, a man who had promised her everything, but the one thing a human heart craves, a connection. She was to be the Duchess of Ice, the mistress of a frozen kingdom, and she was utterly, terrifyingly, alone. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in a silence as heavy and oppressive as the granite skies of the north. The Duke's carriage was a marvel of engineering and luxury, its velvet squabs soft, its movement traveling not just north, but backwards in time, to a more elemental age. Ilara kept her hands folded tightly in the lap of her new traveling dress, a deep blue merino wool chosen by the Duke's man of affairs. It was the finest garment she had ever owned, yet it felt like a costume. She was Lady Ilara Vance no longer. She was Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. The title felt like a borrowed coat, too large and too heavy for her shoulders. As the afternoon light began to fail, the carriage turned off the main road and onto a private drive, plunging into a deep, ancient forest. The trees, mostly oak and yew, were immense, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. A perpetual twilight reigned beneath them. It was intimidating, but also possessed of a wild, stark beauty that called to a lonely part of her soul. After what seemed an eternity, the forest thinned, and Blackwood Manor came into view. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It was not a manor. It was a fortress, built of dark, almost black, local stone. It rose from the landscape with a brooding, organic power. Towers and turrets punctuated a formidable skyline, and countless mullioned windows glittered like hard, watchful eyes. A thin mist coiled around its base, making it seem as if the entire structure were floating on a cloud of sorrow. This was not a home. It was a monument to power and grief. The carriage rolled to a stop before a massive, iron-studded oak door. Before the coachman could dismount, the door swung inward, revealing a line of servants standing at perfect attention in the great hall. They were led by a severe-looking woman in a black silk dress. Her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. The Duke swung down from the carriage and, after a moment's hesitation, turned and offered Ilara his hand. His touch was cool and impersonal, his grip firm as he helped her alight. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily. The brief contact sent a strange, unwelcome flutter through her. He led her inside. The great hall was cavernous, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows far above. Suits of armor stood like silent sentinels along the walls, and faded tapestries depicted grim hunting, sounding small in the echoing space. "My son," the Duke said, his voice dropping even lower. "Where is he?" "He is in the nursery, Your Grace. He has been quiet today." A shadow, fleeting but definite, crossed the Duke's face. "I will see him. Mrs. Gable, show the Duchess to her rooms. See that her belongings are unpacked." He turned and strode toward a grand staircase without another word to Ilara, his footsteps echoing on the stone flags. He had delivered her to her new domain and promptly abandoned her. She was left standing in the center of the immense hall, the object of a dozen pairs of curious servant eyes, feeling more alone than ever. "If you would follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Gable said, her voice cutting through Ilara's paralysis. Ilara followed the housekeeper up the sweeping staircase and down a long, wide corridor. Portraits of past dukes and duchesses of Blackwood lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her progress with stern disapproval. They all had the same dark hair, the same severe cast to their features. They were a formidable dynasty, and she was the unwelcome graft onto their ancient family tree. Mrs. Gable stopped before a set of double doors. "These are the Duchess's apartments, Your Grace. They have been freshly aired." She opened the doors, revealing a suite of rooms that made Ilara's chambers at Greyfell look like a scullery closet. There was a spacious sitting room, decorated in muted tones of cream and pale green, with a comfortable-looking sofa, a writing desk, and a fireplace where a cheerful blaze already crackled. Beyond it lay a large bedroom and a dressing room. The furniture was elegant, the fabrics rich. It was a beautiful, luxurious prison. "Your lady's maid, Anna, will be along shortly. She has been in service at Blackwood for 5 years. She is discreet and capable," Mrs. Gable stated. "Dinner is served at 8. His Grace prefers punctuality." "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Ilara said again, feeling helpless. The housekeeper hesitated at the door. "If there is anything you require, Your Grace, you need only pull the bell cord." Her expression softened. just for a fraction of a second. It is a large house. It can take some time to find one's bearings. With that, she was gone, leaving Ilara alone in the opulent for this forgotten, derelict place. It looked as lonely as she felt. A light tap at the door announced the arrival of Anna, a young woman with a kind, open face and gentle brown eyes. She curtsied, her gaze full of a shy curiosity. "Your Grace, I'm Anna. I'm here to help you unpack and dress for dinner." As Anna moved about the room, her quiet efficiency was a small comfort. Ilara allowed herself to be undressed and helped into a simple evening gown of deep plum silk, another item from the trousseau she had never seen before. As Anna brushed out her hair, Ilara found her voice. "Anna," she began tentatively. "The little boy, the Duke's son. What is his name?" Anna's hands stilled for a moment. "His name is Arthur, Your Grace. He is 5 years old." Is he well?" The maid chose her words carefully. "He is a very quiet child, Your Grace. He has been since his mother passed." The unspoken hung in the air between them. The shadow of the first Duchess, Isabella. Ilara did not dare ask more. Later, descending the grand staircase for dinner, Ilara's apprehension returned. She found the Duke waiting for her in a smaller, more intimate dining room, though intimate was hardly the word for a space that could still seat 20. A long, polished table separated them, glittering with silver and crystal. He stood as she entered, a gesture of pure formality. Dinner was a silent, excruciating affair. Course after course was served by silent footmen. The food was exquisite, but Ilara could barely taste it. The only sounds were the clink of cutlery on porcelain and the crackle of the fire. The Duke ate with a focused economy of movement, his eyes on his plate. He did not look at her. He did not speak to her. She was a ghost at his table. This, then, was to be her life. Shared meals in absolute silence, nights spent in separate wings, days filled with an empty schedule. The terms of their arrangement enacted. After the meal, they retired to an adjacent library. It was a magnificent room, lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books. A fire blazed here as well, and 2 armchairs were placed before it. The Duke gestured for her to take one, and he took the other. For a moment, a wild, foolish hope flickered in her. Perhaps now he would speak. Perhaps they would talk of books, of the estate. His grey eyes were unreadable, but his jaw was tight. "He is sleeping." "Tomorrow, then," she persisted. "You said my duty was to him. I cannot perform that duty if I am a stranger to him." He considered her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were dissecting her thoughts. She held his stare, her heart pounding. "Very well," he said at last, his voice clipped. "I will take you to the nursery after breakfast. But I will offer you a piece of advice, Your Grace. Do not expect much. He does not warm to people easily." He returned to his book, the gesture a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. Ilara leaned back in her chair, the silk of her gown rustling. She looked into the fire, its flames dancing and weaving, full of life and warmth that could not reach across the frozen expanse between them. She had won a small victory, an appointment to meet the boy who was her new purpose. But her husband's warning echoed in her mind. A quiet child who did not warm to people. She felt a kinship with him already. Perhaps, she thought, 2 lonely souls in this great, cold house could find some small comfort in one another. It was a fragile hope, but it was the only one she had. Terminated. The next morning, the Duke was true to his word. After another near-silent breakfast, he led her up a different staircase to the nursery wing. As they walked, Ilara noticed that the portraits along this corridor were different. They were of women and children, softer and more familial than the stern dukes in the main hall. The last one, just before the nursery door, was of a beautiful woman with dark, laughing eyes and a cascade of black curls. She held a swaddled infant in her arms. Isabella, the first Duchess. There was a vibrancy to the painting, a joy that felt alien in this house of shadows. Alistair's gaze flickered to the portrait for a fraction of a second, and his face seemed to harden, the granite lines deepening. He said nothing, pushing open the nursery door. The room was large and bright, with windows overlooking the front drive. It was filled with toys, a rocking horse, wooden soldiers, building blocks, all of them neat and untouched, arranged with a precision that suggested they were rarely played with. In the center of the room, sitting at a small table with a nanny who curtsied nervously, was his own, a silent, impenetrable world. Ilara's heart ached for him. He looked so small and lost in the vast, tidy room. Alistair's jaw tightened in frustration. He took a step forward, as if to command his son's attention, but Ilara put a hand gently on his arm. The gesture was instinctive, meant to stop him, not to connect. But the feel of the hard muscle beneath the fine wool of his coat was startling. He froze, looking down at her hand as if it were a foreign object. She withdrew it quickly, her cheeks flushing. "May I?" she murmured, her gaze on the child. Alistair gave a short, sharp nod and stepped back, crossing his arms and becoming a thunderous presence by the door. The nanny, taking her cue, scurried to the corner of the room. Ilara did not approach Arthur directly. Instead, she walked slowly to the bookshelf and perused the titles. She pulled out a thin volume with a worn blue cover. Then she walked, not to Arthur's table, but to the window seat, settling herself with the book in her lap. She did not speak to him. She did not look at him. She simply sat, a quiet presence in his space. After a few moments of silence, she opened the book and began to read aloud. Her voice was soft, a gentle murmur in the quiet room. It was a simple story about a lost rabbit searching for his home. She did not read with dramatic flair, but with a calm, steady rhythm. She was halfway through the first page when she saw it, a flicker of movement. Arthur had turned his head, just slightly. His dark eyes, so like his father's, but wide with a child's unfiltered solemnity, were fixed on her. He was still holding his block, but he was listening. Ilara didn't acknowledge him. She continued to read, turning the page. She could feel the Duke's intense gaze on her, but she focused all her energy on the story, on the little boy in the window seat of her imagination. When she reached the end of the chapter, where the rabbit finds a warm burrow for the night, she closed the book. She stood up and placed the book back on the shelf. Only then did she look at Arthur. His eyes were still on her, his expression unreadable, but attentive. She gave him a small, tentative smile. He did not smile back, but he did not look away. Without another word, she turned and walked towards Duchess. "Alistair," she said, her voice smooth as silk, though it held a slightly proprietary tone. She stopped, her eyes landing on Ilara, and a look of cool assessment passed over her face. "And this must be the new addition." The Duke's posture stiffened. "Beatrice, this is my wife, the Duchess of Blackwood. Your Grace, may I present Lady Beatrice Carmichael, my late wife's sister." Lady Beatrice executed a flawless, yet somehow insolent, curtsy. "Your Grace, forgive me. I was not aware you were receiving visitors so soon. I came to see my nephew." "Ilara is not a visitor, Beatrice. She is the mistress of this house," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. Beatrice's smile was thin. "Of course. How silly of me. It will simply take some adjustment for all of us. I've been overseeing Arthur's care since dear Isabella's passing. He is a sensitive child. He requires a delicate hand." The implication was clear, a hand that Ilara, the stranger, the interloper, could not possibly possess. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty corridor. This was the secondary antagonist, the manipulative relation. The way she looked at Alistair, the way she spoke of Arthur as "my nephew." It was all a clear staking of territory. Lady Beatrice had established herself as the de facto chatelaine of Blackwood, and she would not relinquish her power easily. "I look forward to getting to know Arthur," Ilara said, her tone polite but firm. "As his mother, it is my first priority." She used the word mother deliberately, a small verbal gauntlet thrown down. Beatrice's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The battle lines, though invisible, had been drawn. This cold, silent house was not just empty, it was occupied territory, and Ilara would have to fight for every inch of it. The days at Blackwood Manor settled into a rigid, unvarying routine. Breakfast with a silent Duke, an hour in the nursery, where Ilara's patient strategy with Arthur began to yield microscopic results. He would now sit near her while she read, and had once, astonishingly, pointed a small finger at a picture of a badger. Lunch, eaten alone in her sitting room. Afternoon spent wandering the vast empty halls. She needed a project, a purpose that was wholly her own, something that could not be touched or tainted by Beatrice's influence or Alistair's indifference. Her gaze kept returning to the walled garden. It called to her. Its neglect mirrored her own feelings of abandonment, its wild disarray, a reflection of the chaos in her own heart. To bring it back to life, she thought, might be to reclaim a piece of herself. One morning, she sought out Mrs. Gable in her office, a small, tidy room filled with ledgers and keys. "Mrs. Gable," Ilara began, "there is a walled garden at the rear of the property. It appears neglected." The housekeeper's pen stopped scratching. She looked up, her expression guarded. "That is the late Duchess's garden, Your Grace. It has been locked since she passed." "I would like the key," Ilara said simply. Mrs. Gable's face was a mask of consternation. "Your Grace, I am not certain. His Grace gave explicit instructions that no one was to enter. His Grace also gave explicit instructions that I am the mistress of this house," Ilara countered, gently but firmly. "A garden left to ruin is a poor reflection on the estate. I wish to restore it." The housekeeper seemed torn. Her loyalty to her master was absolute, but Ilara's request was not unreasonable. More than that, there was a quiet determination in the new Duchess's eyes that was difficult to refuse. "The garden, it was her ladyship's great passion," Mrs. Gable said, her voice softening. "She designed it herself. It was a place of great beauty." Her eyes held a deep, old sadness. "The key is kept in the Duke's study. Only he has it." The information was a blow. To ask him for it would be to invite a refusal, to subject her small, burgeoning hope to his cold dismissal. But the image of the garden, of the potential for life buried under all that death and decay, had taken root in her mind. She would not be deterred. She would have to wait for an opportunity. It came 3 days later. The Duke was called away to a tenant farm on the far side of the estate, a full day's business. Ilara watched his horse disappear down the drive before she made her move. His study was his sanctuary, a place she had never entered. To do so felt like a profound transgression. But her need for the key was greater than containing maps, geological surveys, and, on a series of velvet-lined hooks, a collection of keys. They were old, ornate, and clearly labeled. Her eyes scanned them, and her breath caught. One label, in elegant, fading script, read, "Isabella's Garden." The key hanging from it was smaller than the others, made of brass, with a heart-shaped bow. Her hand trembled as she reached for the case. It was unlocked. She lifted the small brass key from its hook. It felt warm in her palm, a small, solid piece of the past. As she closed her fingers around it, her eyes fell on something else, half hidden behind a stack of ledgers on the desk. It was a small, silver-framed daguerreotype, face down. Unable to resist, she picked it up and turned it over. It was Isabella. Not the smiling, laughing woman from the portrait, but a different Isabella. Her expression was haunted, her eyes wide and shadowed with a sorrow so profound it seemed to leap from the silvered plate. She was holding a single, perfect white rose. It was a portrait of unimaginable sadness. A sudden noise in the hall, a footman dropping a tray, made her jump. Guilt and fear washed over her. She quickly put the photograph back, exactly as she had found it, face down, and clutched the key in her hand. She slipped out of the study, her heart racing, and did not stop until she was back in the safety of her own rooms. She stood at her window, the key a secret weight in her palm, looking down at the walled garden. She had what she wanted, but she had also seen something she was not meant to see, a glimpse of the profound tragedy that lay at the heart of Blackwood Manor. The garden was not just neglected, it was a place of sorrow, locked away with its secrets, and she was about to step inside. Armed with the brass key, Ilara felt a thrill of nervous purpose. She waited until the following afternoon, a time when she knew Lady Beatrice was not expected and Arthur was napping. She changed into her plainest dress and found a pair of sturdy gardening gloves in a disused potting shed. Then, with her heart beating a little too fast, she walked across the frosty terraces to the ivy-choked wooden door set into the garden wall. The lock was stiff from disuse, covered in moss, and what must have been magnificent rose arbors were now tangled, thorny skeletons. But it was not entirely dead. Resilient perennials pushed their leaves through the debris. A hardy climbing clematis still showed a few pale, late-season blooms. The bones of a magnificent garden were still here, waiting to be uncovered. It was a place of deep sadness, yes, but also of stubborn, tenacious life. She found a small, dilapidated shed in one corner. Inside, tools were rusted but salvageable. There was also a small wooden stool and a wicker basket. Tucked inside the basket, beneath a canvas sheet, was a piece of embroidery stretched on a hoop. Ilara picked it up. It was a delicate, intricate depiction of a nightingale, only half finished. The needle was still threaded, resting in the fabric, as if its owner had set it down only moments ago, intending to return. This must have been Isabella's. It was a poignant, intimate glimpse of the woman who had created this place. A woman who loved beauty, who had patience for intricate work, but whose own thread had been abruptly cut. Ilara gently placed it back in the basket, feeling like an intruder in a sacred space. She began with a small, manageable patch near the door. She knelt on the cold ground and started to pull the weeds, her gloved hands working methodically. The physical labor was a balm. It was simple, honest work. For every weed she pulled, she felt a small measure of her own anxiety and frustration ease. She was not thinking of the Duke, or of Beatrice, or of her own lonely existence. She was focused only on the soil, on distinguishing the intruders from the dormant treasures buried beneath. She worked for over an hour, her muscles beginning to ache, her face smudged with dirt. She cleared a small section of pathway and uncovered the crowns of what looked like a stand of peonies. A sense of profound satisfaction washed over her. It was a small, almost insignificant beginning, but it was hers. Over the next few weeks, the garden became her sanctuary. She spent 2 hours there every afternoon. Anna, her loyal maid, would watch for her from the window, ready to give a signal if the Duke returned unexpectedly or if Beatrice arrived. The other staff, noticing her daily pilgrimage, began to leave a flask of hot tea and a small plate of biscuits for her, just out to demand the key, to order her away from that place of painful memory. But he had stopped. Something in her posture, the quiet determination with which she knelt in the dirt, held him back. She was not desecrating the space. She was tending to it. He found himself drawn to the window every afternoon. He watched her toil, her face serene and focused. He saw the slow, steady transformation she was working. A path emerged. A stone bench was cleared of moss. The tangled chaos began to resolve into faint lines of order and care. And he saw the effect it was having on her. In the garden, she was not the pale, haunted girl from Greyfell, nor the timid duchess who sat in silence at his dinner table. She was strong, capable, her movements filled with a quiet grace. The work brought a flush to her cheeks and a light to her eyes. He also saw her with Arthur. Her patience with his son was saint-like. She never pushed, never demanded. She simply created a space of calm and invited him into it. One afternoon, he came upon them in the library. Arthur was not sitting apart from her, but next to her on a large sofa, his small head leaning against her arm as she read to him. The boy looked up at his father, his expression neutral, but he did not pull away from Ilara. He was comfortable. He was content. That evening, as Alistair sat in his customary armchair in the library, pretending to read, he found himself observing his wife. She was reading too, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight played on her hair, finding threads of gold in the simple brown. She was not a classic beauty like Isabella had been. Her features were quieter, more subtle, but there was an integrity to her face, a stillness, and a strength that he was beginning to find compelling. He had purchased a duchess, a functionary, a solution to a problem. He had not expected a woman of such quiet fortitude. He had not expected her to invade his locked spaces, his son's silent world, his late wife's derelict garden, and bring, not disruption, but a gentle, healing light. Culling the upper gallery, when he heard a sound from the music room, a room that had been silent for 2 years. It was the soft, hesitant notes of a pianoforte, playing a simple, melancholic air. He stopped, hidden by a pillar, and looked in. It was something other than duty or irritation. It was curiosity, a reluctant, grudging respect. As they rose from the table, he spoke. "Your campaign against the wilderness seems to be meeting with some success." Ilara froze, her hand on the back of her chair. She looked at him, her violet eyes wide with surprise. It was the first time he had initiated a conversation that was not strictly about household matters. "Enjoy the work, Your Grace," she stammered. "The weeds have been on the retreat for weeks," he continued, his tone dry, almost teasing. It was the closest he had ever come to humor. "They have put up a valiant but ultimately futile resistance." A small, hesitant smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. "They are stubborn adversaries, to be sure." He simply nodded, the ghost of a smile playing on his own lips for a fleeting instant before it was gone. He turned and walked toward the library, expecting her to follow as usual. It was a minuscule interaction, a handful of words in a sea of silence. But for Elara, it was a profound shift. It was a glimmer of light in the permafrost. The Duke had noticed her. He had approved. And in his own clipped, sardonic way, he had paid her a compliment. The key she had stolen had unlocked more than just a garden gate. It had opened a small, previously sealed fissure in the wall of ice around her husband's heart. The fragile truce, established by a handful of words over dinner, was soon put to the test. Lady Beatrice, sensing a subtle shift in the household dynamics, escalated her campaign. She could no longer rely on Elara's complete isolation. The new Duchess was slowly, quietly, carving out a space for herself. The garden was flourishing under her care, and more alarmingly, Arthur was beginning to emerge from his shell. He had spoken his first full sentence to Elara a week prior, asking for a specific storybook, a milestone that had sent a wave of quiet joy through the nursery staff and a jolt of alarm through Beatrice. She chose her moment with a predator's cunning. She arrived one afternoon when Elara was in the garden and Alastair was in his study. She swept into the nursery, her arms laden with expensive toys, her smile bright and false. Elara, returning to the house with dirt on her hands and a smudge on her cheek, heard of her hand. "I was just telling him a story about his mother, about how much she loved to push him on the swing in the garden. I thought it would be a comfort." Elara's blood ran cold. The garden, Isabella's garden. The one place that was a shrine to his late wife's memory, a place Alastair had forbidden anyone from entering. Beatrice had deliberately connected Arthur's nascent happiness with Elara to the memory of his dead mother, creating a toxic association in his fragile mind. It was an act of breathtaking cruelty, disguised as loving remembrance. "Get out," Elara said, her voice low and shaking with a fury she had never known she possessed. Beatrice raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "I beg your pardon. You heard me. Get out of this room. Now." Elara scooped the trembling Arthur into her arms, holding him tight against her chest. He clung to her, his small body racked with sobs. "Well, I never," Beatrice huffed, gathering her dignity. "I was only trying to help. Clearly the child is overwrought. Perhaps your methods are not as effective as you believe." She swept from the room, leaving a trail of poisonous perfume in her wake. Elara ignored her, focusing all her attention on the little boy in her arms. She rocked him gently, murmuring soft, nonsensical words of comfort, until his sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. The door opened again. It was Alastair. He must have heard the commotion. He stood in the doorway, his face a thundercloud, his gaze taking in the scene. Elara on the floor, cradling his son, the discarded new toys, the lingering tension in the air. "What is going on here?" he demanded. Before Elara could answer, Beatrice reappeared behind him. "Alastair, thank heavens. I am so glad you are here. I am beside myself with worry." Her voice was thick with manufactured distress. "I was sharing a fond memory of Isabella with Arthur, and he became hysterical. The Duchess then, she ordered me from the room. I fear the boy's equilibrium has been terribly upset. Her Grace is new to these matters, of course. She cannot be expected to understand the delicacy required." "It was only enough!" Alastair's voice cut through the air like a whip. He looked down at Arthur, who was now hiding his face in Elara's shoulder, and a muscle worked in his jaw. He seemed to be weighing their conflicting accounts. For a terrible moment, Elara was certain he would believe his sister-in-law, the woman who had been part of his life for years, over the stranger he had married. He took a deep breath. "Beatrice, leave us. I will speak with you later." Beatrice looked stunned. "But Alistair, leave us!" he repeated, and this time his voice held a command that even she dared not disobey. She shot Ilara a look of pure venom before turning and stalking away. The door closed, leaving the three of them in a tense, ringing silence. Alistair did not speak. He walked over and knelt, not beside Ilara, but in front of his son. "Arthur," he said, his voice quiet. He reached out a hand, not to take him, but simply to rest it on his son's back. It was a gesture of profound, uncharacteristic tenderness. Arthur flinched, but did not pull away. Ilara held her breath. This was a critical moment. "Lady Beatrice was wrong to upset you," Alistair said, his gaze fixed on his son. "This is your home. The Duchess is your mother now. She is here to care for you. No one will be permitted to cause you distress. Do you understand?" It was not an apology, but it was an affirmation, a declaration of her place, her role, made directly to the person who mattered most. It was a validation that stunned Ilara with its quiet power. He looked at Ilara then, his eyes searching hers. "What did she say?" "Precisely. She told him about his mother pushing him on a swing in the garden," Ilara explained softly. "She knows he has been spending time with me there." Alistair's face darkened further. He understood the poison in the act immediately. He was silent for a long moment, the muscle in his jaw working again. He was processing, judging. "My late wife," he began, his voice strained, "suffered from a great sadness. After Arthur's birth, the garden was her only refuge. When I locked it, I thought I was protecting her memory. And protecting him. He no longer just the hired functionary. She was being invited to be a partner. A junior partner, perhaps, in the limited enterprise of raising his son, but a partner nonetheless. "Barrier. Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. "It is." He nodded, then rose to his feet, his brief moment of openness receding as he straightened his shoulders, the mask of the Duke settling back into place. But something had fundamentally changed. The shared challenge had forced them into a reluctant coalition. They were no longer two strangers living parallel lives under the same roof. They were allies, bound by a common cause. And as Ilara continued to comfort the small boy in her arms, she realized that Lady Beatrice's vicious attack had backfired spectacularly. In her attempt to drive a wedge between them, she had only succeeded in pushing them together. The uneasy alliance between Ilara and Alistair held, solidifying into a quiet, functional partnership where Arthur was concerned. They began to meet for a brief period each evening in the library, not to sit in silence, but to discuss the boy's day. The conversations were formal, focused, and yet they were a revolutionary change. He would ask about Arthur's lessons, his moods, his appetite. She would report on the books they had read, the pictures he had drawn, the small signs of his slow emergence. During one of these meetings, Beatrice's name came up. Alistair mentioned, in a clipped tone, that he had spoken to her. "She will be limiting her visits for the time being," he stated, his gaze fixed on the fire. "She believes the country air is not agreeing with her constitution." Ilara understood the euphemism. He had disciplined her, put her back in her place. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it was almost dizzying. But Beatrice was not one to retreat without a parting shot. A few days later, a letter arrived for Ilara, delivered on a silver tray. The handwriting was Beatrice's elegant, sharp script. With a sense of foreboding, Ilara broke the seal. The letter was ostensibly an apology, full of flowery phrases about her deep love for her nephew and her regret at having caused any distress. But tucked into the final paragraph was a barb, also cast him in a terrible light. Had his devotion to duty, his emotional remoteness, made him blind to his wife's suffering? The thought was deeply unsettling. She looked at the man across the dinner table that night, at the harsh lines of his face, and saw him through a new, more complicated lens. Was his coldness a shield against guilt? Was his grief not just for his loss, but for his own perceived failure? It made him more human, more tragic, but also more culpable. A seed of doubt, of pity, mixed with a strange kind of fear, began to sprout within her. The incident with Beatrice and the subsequent alliance, however, had one unforeseen consequence. Arthur, having seen Ilara defend him and his father support her, began to trust her more completely. He started to seek her out, tugging on her sleeve to lead her to the library or the music room. He even began to venture into the garden with her. At first, he would just stand by the door, watching. Then, one day, he took a few tentative steps down the path she had cleared. He pointed to the green shoots of the crocuses. "Flowers?" he asked, his small voice a question. "Yes, darling. They're sleeping now, but they will be flowers in the spring," she said, her heart swelling. He seemed to accept this. The garden, which Beatrice had tried to turn into a place of fear for him, was becoming his, too. Under Ilara's gentle guidance, it was being reclaimed not as a site of tragedy, but as a place of quiet discovery. This fragile peace was shattered a fortnight later. A wave of winter sickness was sweeping the county, and despite the staff's best efforts, it breached the walls of Blackwood Manor. Arthur woke one morning with a flushed face and a feverish heat radiating from his small body. The house was thrown into a quiet, controlled panic. The local doctor was summoned, a bluff, elderly man who diagnosed a severe influenza and prescribed bed rest, cool compresses, and careful watching. Ilara immediately installed herself in the nursery. She dismissed the anxious nanny, telling her to get some rest. This was her duty, her purpose. She would not leave his side. She bathed his hot forehead with lavender water, coaxed sips of broth and water between his lips, and read to him in a low, soothing murmur. Hours later. And 2 hours after that. Throughout the long night, he was a recurring presence, a dark shadow in the doorway, his face etched with an anxiety he could not conceal. The second day was worse. Arthur's fever climbed, and he grew listless, his breathing shallow. The doctor returned, his expression grim. There was nothing more to be done but wait for the fever to break. That night, Alistair did not just appear in the doorway. He came in and took the chair on the other side of the bed. He did not speak, but his presence filled the room. They sat in a shared, silent vigil as the storm of the fever raged through Arthur's small body. The only sounds were the boy's ragged breaths, the ticking of the clock on the mantel, and the howling of the wind outside, a pathetic fallacy for the turmoil within the room. Ilara, exhausted and running on pure nervous energy, continued her ministrations. She changed the cool cloths, smoothed the blankets, whispered to the boy. At one point, she began to hum a simple lullaby, an old tune her own mother had sung to her. She was not aware of Alistair watching her until she felt his gaze. She looked up and met his eyes across the bed. In the dim lamplight, his face was stripped bare of its ducal mask. She saw not a cold, remote master, but a terrified father. And in his eyes, there was a look of raw, unguarded anguish. Sometime after midnight, Arthur's breathing began to change. It grew deeper, more regular. Ilara placed a hand on his forehead. The ferocious heat was receding. He was still hot, but the crisis had passed. He had fallen into a deep, natural sleep. A wave of relief so profound it left her weak washed over Ilara. She slumped back in her chair, her body trembling with the release of tension. "It's broken," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "The fever has broken." Alistair leaned forward, placing his own large hand on his son's brow, his touch surprisingly gentle. He closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them, they were glistening with an emotion Ilara had never thought to see in him. He was not weeping, but the tears were there, held in check by a lifetime of control. He looked at Ilara, at her pale, exhausted the window, staring out at the dark, windswept night. His back was to her, a rigid line of black broadcloth. "She suffered from a profound melancholy after Arthur was born," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, a recitation of a script he had played in his mind 1,000 times. "We did not have a name for it then. I did not understand it. I thought it was a weakness she should overcome. I was busy. There was always business. The estate, London. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air. Elara's heart ached for him, for the guilt that was so clearly consuming him. Beatrice's words had been a cruel half-truth. She loved the garden, he continued, his voice softer now, laced with pain. It was her creation, her sanctuary. One afternoon I returned from a trip. The house was too quiet. I found her there, in the garden. She had taken her own life. The bald, terrible truth of it struck Elara with more force than any rumor or innuendo. The beautiful, vibrant woman from the portrait, the patient embroiderer of the nightingale, had been so lost in sorrow that she had chosen to leave it all behind. I locked the garden, he went on, his voice cracking for the first time. I locked it because I could not bear to look at it. Every flower, every path was a condemnation. I failed her, you see. I was her husband. I should have seen. I should have understood. My coldness, my distance. I built this fortress around myself to be strong, and in the end it was the very thing that left her alone when she needed me most. He finally turned to face her, and his face was a mask of raw, undisguised agony. The Duke of Blackwood was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a sea of self-blame, a grief so deep and so old it had frozen him from the inside out. "That is why I brought you here," he whispered, the final, devastating confession. I could not give my son a mother's love. I did not have it in me. I thought I could purchase it. A practical solution. I sought out a woman with no connections, no expectations, who would not demand from me the warmth. His own shattered heart. Her own exhaustion fell away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. She stood up and crossed the space between them. He watched her approach, his eyes full of a terrible vulnerability. He expected condemnation, or perhaps pity. She gave him neither. She simply reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. It was a small, simple gesture, a point of human contact in the vast, cold landscape of his sorrow. He flinched, as if her touch might burn him, but he did not pull away. His muscles were rigid beneath her hand. A lifetime of tension coiled there. She said nothing. There were no words that could mend such a wound. There was only presence, only the silent offering of understanding. She looked up at his face, her violet eyes holding his tormented grey ones. And for the first time, she did not see a duke or a husband of convenience. She saw Alistair, a man in desperate need of grace. And in that quiet moment, as the wind howled outside, and his son breathed peacefully in the next room, the entire foundation of their arrangement crumbled into dust. The sick room had become a sanctuary, and her simple, compassionate touch was the first ray of dawn after a long, dark, frozen night. He did not move, did not speak. But she felt a subtle shift in him, the first infinitesimal release of a tension he had held for 2 long years. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then back to her face. And in his eyes she saw the dawning of a terrible, beautiful, and terrifying hope. The air in the nursery was thick with the weight of his confession. Alistair stood frozen, his gaze fixed on her hand, as if it were an anchor in a raging sea. The mask of the Duke had not just cracked, it had shattered, and the man beneath was exposed, raw and bleeding. Elara kept her hand on his arm, a steady, reassuring pressure. She was no longer afraid of him. How could one be afraid of someone so profoundly wounded? "It was not your fault," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate, but needing to be said. "You cannot blame yourself for not understanding an illness that no one understood." Barrett, as he shook his head, a gesture of deep that she was failing in her duty as a duchess, that her melancholy was an indulgence, an insult to my name. She told her I was displeased with her, that I found her tiresome. He closed his eyes, the memory clearly agonizing. Beatrice cultivated Isabella's despair, watered it like a prize rose. For her own ambition, she wanted to be the indispensable one, the true mistress of Blackwood, first through her sister, and then after. The full scope of Beatrice's treachery was revealed, and it was monstrous. She had not just been an irritant, she had been a poisoner of the soul. She had seen Isabella's vulnerability not as a reason to help, but as an opportunity to exploit. The piece of the puzzle that had been missing, the catalyst that pushed Isabella from melancholy into utter despair, slid into place. She preyed on her weakness. Ilara breathed, horrified. She preyed on my absence, Alistair corrected, the guilt resurfacing. I gave her the opening. I created the vacuum, and she filled it with her poison. He finally pulled his arm away from Ilara's touch, not as a rejection, but because he needed to move. He paced the length of the room, the caged energy of 2 years of suppressed rage and grief pouring out of him. I banished her from my sight, but I could not banish her from the county. She is still family, a connection I cannot legally sever. So I let her linger, a ghost at the feast. I let her have access to my son. I could not bring myself to explain the full depths of her depravity. How do you tell a court of law that a woman was murdered with words? He stopped and faced Ilara, his hands clenched into fists. So I buried it, all of it. I buried my wife, I buried the truth, and I buried my own heart along with them. He stood before her, utterly spent, having finally voiced the poison he had held inside for so long. The silence that followed was different. It was not empty or cold. It was a shared space, holding the enormity of his pain. Ilara thought of the half-finished embroidery of the nightingale, of the sad-eyed woman in the daguerreotype, of the neglected garden. It was all one story, a story of a delicate soul. Something new and terrifyingly vulnerable began to grow. He took a hesitant step toward her, mirroring her own movement. The space between them shrank until they were only a breath apart. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm, real. The contact was electric, a stark contrast to the cold, formal touch when he had helped her from the carriage. This was different. This was a connection. Ilara, he said, her name a quiet discovery on his lips. He did not say more. He did not need to. His eyes, those stormy gray eyes that had held so much pain, were now filled with a maelstrom of other emotions. Gratitude, regret, and a dawning wonder. He leaned in, slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat. She did not. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, her own feelings a confusing, powerful torrent. She felt pity, compassion, and something more, a deep, resonant pull toward this broken, beautiful man. She raised her face to his. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was tentative, searching, a question asked in a language beyond words. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared sorrow, and of the first, fragile promise of healing. It was the taste of tears and the hope of dawn. When he pulled back, they simply looked at each other, the air crackling with the momentous shift that had just occurred. The contract was broken. The arrangement was void. In the quiet of the nursery, with his sleeping son as their witness, a man and a woman who had been husband and wife in name only had taken the first terrifying step toward becoming something else entirely, something real. The next morning, the house felt different. The air, usually so still and heavy, seemed lighter. Sunlight, pale but clear, streamed through the tall windows of the breakfast room. Arthur was awake, his fever gone, demanding toast with a querulous but healthy energy that was music to Ilara's ears. Alistair entered the room as Ilara was helping Arthur into a chair. He looked tired, but the haunted, rigid quality was gone. He looked calmer.
Look at the house or at anyone who watched her go.
The secondary antagonist, the poison in the well of Blackwood, had been summarily and permanently vanquished. With her departure, it was as if the final shadow had been lifted from the house. The staff, who had long endured Beatrice's imperious ways, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. There was a new lightness in their steps, a murmur of conversation in the halls that had once been silent. Alistair began to change, the transformation slow but profound. He started joining Ilara and Arthur in the nursery for the story hour. He would not read, but he would sit in a nearby chair, listening, his presence a quiet, solid reassurance. He began to talk to his son, not with commands, but with questions. He asked Arthur what he was drawing, what he was building, what he was thinking. One afternoon, he came to find Ilara in the garden. She was on her knees, carefully planting the daffodil bulbs she had found in a dusty sack in the shed. She looked up, surprised, as his tall shadow fell over her. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out a small, sharp trowel with a new wooden handle. Her old one was rusted and bent. She took it from him, her dirt-smudged fingers brushing against his. "Thank you." He did not leave. He stood for a moment, looking around at the work she had done. The paths were clear now. The fountain had been scrubbed. The rose bushes were pruned and tidy, and the entire space, while still bare in the grip of winter, was neat and orderly, humming with the potential of the coming spring. "It looks hopeful," he said, the words seeming foreign on his tongue. "It is," she said, smiling up at him. "It just needed some attention." The double meaning hung in the air between them. He had needed attention too. He had needed someone to see past the thorns and the neglect, to the life that was still waiting underneath. He gestured to a newly cleared stone bench. "May I?" "Of course." He sat, and for a while they worked in a comfortable silence. She planting her bulbs, he simply watching, being present. It was a simple, domestic scene, yet for them it was revolutionary. It was the first time they had shared. He was a different man now. The cold arrogance was gone, replaced by a humble gravity. "I find myself hoping for more than our arrangement," he said, his gaze intense. "I am hoping for a chance to begin again, to build a true marriage with you, one of partnership, of friendship, and if you would have it, of love." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I know I have no right to ask it of you. I have been a cold and distant brute. But I am asking anyway. Will you give me that chance, Ilara? Will you allow me to try to be the husband you deserve?" Ilara's heart, which she had so carefully guarded, felt as if it would burst. Over the past months, she had seen the man behind the mask. She had seen his pain, his guilt, his deep, buried capacity for love, which she saw every time he looked at his son. She had, against all odds and all reason, fallen in love with him. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy and relief. "There is nothing I would want more." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his severe features, making him breathtakingly handsome. It was like seeing the sun rise over a winter landscape. He crossed the room to her in 2 long strides and knelt before her chair. He took her hands in his. "I have spent 2 years living in the past, haunted by it. You have shown me that it is possible to look toward the future." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out a small velvet-covered box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a locket. It was not an old, inherited piece. It was new, fashioned from shining gold, simple and elegant. "This is not to replace the past," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Isabella will always be a part of this house, a part of Arthur's story. But this is for our story." He opened the locket. Ilara expected to see a space for a portrait, but it was empty. Instead, lying inside on one half of the locket, was a single, tiny, found their home in each other. 1 year later, the garden at Blackwood Manor was a riot of color. The roses that had been thorny skeletons now climbed the walls in a profusion of crimson and white, their perfume heavy on the warm summer air. The peonies Ilara had uncovered bloomed in great exuberant pink and white globes, and the paths were lined with lavender, foxglove, and delphiniums. The fountain, scrubbed clean, gurgled merrily, its water sparkling in the sun. The garden was not just restored, it was reborn, more beautiful than it had ever been. A child's laughter echoed from the far end of the lawn. Arthur, now a sturdy, confident 6-year-old, was chasing a butterfly, his face alight with a joy that had once seemed impossible. He was no longer a silent, solemn little ghost. He was a boy, full of life and mischief, his father's dark hair shining in the sun, his mother's violet eyes sparkling with delight. Ilara sat on the stone bench, a book lying forgotten in her lap, watching him. She wore a simple dress of pale yellow muslin, and the gold locket was a warm weight against her skin. A comfortable, familiar arm settled around her shoulders, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband. Alistair pressed a light kiss to her temple. The severe lines of his face had softened over the past year. Laughter came more easily to him now, and the icy grey of his eyes had warmed to the color of a gentle summer rain. He was still the Duke of Blackwood, a man of power and responsibility, but he was also simply Alistair, a husband and a father who had learned to live in the light. "He's going to trample the snapdragons," Alistair murmured, his voice full of fond amusement. "Let him," Ilara laughed. "We can plant more." They watched their son in comfortable silence for a moment. The house that had once been a fortress of grief was now a home, filled with warmth and the sounds of family. The silent dinners were a distant memory, replaced by lively meals full of Arthur's chatter and their own easy conversation. The separate wings had long been abandoned for a shared master suite, where they talked late into the night and woke in each other's arms. "Do you remember the first time I saw you?" Alistair asked. His voice alone still held a hint of the wonder he felt every time he touched her. It was a kiss of gratitude, of shared history, and of a future that stretched before them, bright and full of promise. Arthur, having abandoned his butterfly chase, came running toward them, his hands full of slightly crushed daisies. "For you, Mamma," he said, pressing the flowers into her hand. "They're beautiful, darling. Thank you," she said, her heart full. He then turned to his father and, with the solemnity only a 6-year-old can muster, held out a single, slightly bedraggled dandelion. "And for you, Papa." Alistair took the weed as if it were a crown jewel. "Thank you, son. It's the finest one in the whole garden." Arthur beamed, and then ran off again, his task complete. Alistair looked from the dandelion in his hand to Ilara, his eyes shining with a love so profound it needed no words. He tucked the dandelion into the buttonhole of his coat. They sat together, hand in hand, watching their son play in the sun-drenched garden. The ghosts of the past were not gone, but they were at peace, their sorrow transformed into a gentle memory that served as a reminder of how precious their present happiness was. The Duchess of Ice and the Frozen Duke were no more. In their place were simply Ilara and Alistair, two people who had found in the ruins of grief a love that was strong enough to heal, to rebuild, and to bloom more beautifully than either of them could have ever imagined. Dear listener, have you ever felt like you were living in a walled garden? A place where your own potential lies dormant, choked by the weeds of past hurts, of neglect, or of a sorrow so profound it feels like a permanent winter. Ilara's story is a quiet reminder that the most powerful force for change is not a grand gesture, but the steady, patient act of tending to what is broken. We often look at people who are emotionally distant, like Alistair, and see only the coldness, the impenetrable walls they have built. We see the ice, but not the devastating fire of grief that it was formed to contain. We forget that behind the most formidable fortresses often lies the most vulnerable heart, terrified of being wounded again. What Ilara teaches us is the transformative power of quiet compassion. She did not try to storm Alistair's castle. Strength, the story suggests, is not in avoiding the pain, but in having the courage to kneel in the dirt, to pull the weeds one by one, and to trust in the promise of spring. It is the quiet, consistent application of care to a project, to another person, to ourselves, that allows the most resilient and beautiful things to grow. May you have the patience to tend to the gardens in your own life, and the wisdom to see the hidden potential for bloom in even the most desolate of landscapes. Barrett, thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even after the longest winter, spring is always waiting to return.